Afternoon. It is one of these wonderful summer afternoons, isn't it? It got me thinking about my dad. He used to write essays when he was alive. He could always tell a good story or describe something in a way that I thought was just wonderful. And so I wanted to share with you today. I'm going to read for you one of his essays just entitled Homemade Ice Cream, because summer is a wonderful time for homemade ice cream. If you have ever had any, if you haven't, you need to. But here it is. And that's all I'm doing today. Is just sharing this just as a little piece of entertainment. Homemade ice cream. Certain foods are regarded as comfort foods, and ice cream is just one of those. I don't know who invented it, but what a great use of cream and milk and eggs and fruit and nuts and chocolate and whatever else you can think to put into it. Now, what I want to talk about is a subset of this food group referred to in some circles as homemade. And he spelled it H-O-M-A-D-E, homemade. It can be made any time of year, but to be honest, you really need to start out with a hot summer day afternoon or early evening. You need a backyard or back porch or somewhere that the salt water can run off without a problem. Next, you need an ice cream freezer, about 25 to 40 pounds of crushed ice, a bag of rock salt, and the makings for ice cream. Summertime is the time for homemade ice cream because of the reason I mentioned above and the fact that you have to get your hands in that crushed ice. And this ice cream, due to the way it's made, is at a temperature several degrees colder than the ice cream in the carton in the freezer inside your house. It's so cold that after a couple of bowls, few people can stop with just one. Your throat muscles have cooled to the point that you have the inclination to want to cough. My Aunt Margaret always said that when you cough, you've had enough and you have to stop. Now, the ice cream freezer we had when I was a boy was a tall wooden bucket made from cedar slats. It had a container that was good for 1.5 gallons of ice cream with the dasher inside it. The metal container fit into the center with a removable top, which had a hole in the center where the top of the dasher shaft stuck out. There was a crank and a gearbox that fit on top of the whole assembly. There were as many recipes for homemade ice cream as there are leaves on a maple tree. The best were what I refer to as the boiled custard base, with fresh fruit such as fresh peaches or blueberries. In any event, I can remember strawberry and peach and banana. I remember vanilla and chocolate and pineapple and blackberry and even raspberry. Making ice cream was a family event that followed a Sunday night dinner gathering or Sunday afternoon gathering. But at my house, it could have been about any night of the week. The trick was having the ingredients. And since we always had out on the farm a good, ample, fresh supply of whole milk and heavy cream, all we were looking for was the fruit and the crushed ice and being able to convince Mother to make the custard. Now, you need to know that crushed ice is not the stuff that comes from those plastic bags in the box out in front of the convenience store. To get real crushed ice, we would go over to Tudor's Cold Storage, which was the local ice plant in Danville. You could get a 50-pound bag for 85 cents, freshly crushed. They would go into the plant, they'd put a big block of ice into the crusher, and it would fill a paper bag all the way to the top, and they would close it with a twisted wire. The thing that made freshly crushed ice perfect for making ice cream in the hand crank freezer was the fact that the crushing process left the ice in particles that ranged from about 1 inch all the way down to ice dust. And this all melted quickly, which speeded up the freezing process for the ice cream, which the children all appreciated. Now, making ice cream is a basic lesson in physics. It's a matter of transferring the cold from the ice to the ice cream. You have a wooden bucket that has a closed container in the center connected to a crank at the top to turn it. Space between the inside of the bucket and the cylinder that holds ice cream is filled with alternating layers of crushed ice and rock salt. The crank is then turned, which turns the cylinder in one direction and turns the dasher in the opposite direction. The dasher is made of metal and wood, and that fits together inside the mix container. The purpose is to scrape down the sides of the container as the mix starts to freeze on the walls until all the mix is frozen and it can no longer be turned. And as the salt melts the ice, the temperature is lowered, cooling the metal side of the mix cylinder, cooling the mix closest to the cylinder to the freezing point, and so on until the whole container of the mix is frozen. Today's homemade ice cream freezers are generally driven with electric motors and take about 15 to 30 minutes to freeze a container of ice cream. But in the earlier days, the crank kind was powered by manual labor. Usually one of the boys or girls would start, and then they would alternate taking turns at the crank until they were tired. As the ice cream gradually froze, the crank would become harder to turn. Pretty soon, one of those children would be called over to sit on the top of the freezer to add weight to stabilize it while someone was attempting to turn the crank. And finally, one of the men would have to finish the turning as it would become too hard for one of the younger ones to turn. And finally, it was ready to open. Mother would be summoned and would come out with a large spoon to dip out the ice cream, a dishpan in which to put the dasher, a wet dishcloth to wipe off the salty surface to prevent salt from getting into the ice cream when the container was opened. She'd have a stack of bowls and spoons and napkins, and the line would form. Ladies first, and then children, and then the men would be invited to sample what the freezer had to offer. I'll tell you, some was better than others, but I never had a bad batch of homemade ice cream. If there was enough, you could come back for seconds. You were allowed to have seconds and to keep eating it until you coughed. Because I said, as Aunt Margaret used to say, when you coughed, you'd had enough and it was time to stop. The other reason that seconds were tolerated was that homemade ice cream was a treat for the moment. It was no good really to be stored or eaten later. You could put homemade ice cream into the freezer in the house, but it would become hard as a rock and it would just change the texture. So we knew we were just to keep passing it around until the container was empty. Now that I think about it, I sure wish I had a bowl of fresh peach ice cream right now. That is my favorite. And given the opportunity to have a bowl, I'm confident that you would declare that it was the best you ever had too. Written by George R. Carter Jr., October 15th, 2003. Just a little something for your summer afternoon. Have a great day.